Afternoon of 18 August 1966, the Australian soldiers in 11 Platoon begin to infiltrate deeper eastwards into the Long Tân rubber plantation, spreading out in sections as they move ahead of the rest of D Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. Tasked with searching for signs of Viet Cong activity in the vicinity, rock and roll music from a concert taking place at the nearby base occasionally wafts through the trees, painting something of a surreal atmosphere as the diggers silently move through the tropical landscape. A twig snaps, a bush rustles, and suddenly they make first contact with the enemy as a squad of Viet Cong, unaware of the presence, blunders right into them. Platoon Sergeant Bob Buick is first to react and fires, wounding a VC before they disappear into the surrounding lush vegetation of the plantation. The Australians make a note of the fact that these men were dressed in khaki camouflage uniforms and carried Russian Kalashnikovs, an ominous sign that meant they were facing main force, the true look of full-time Viet Cong. These soldiers, as opposed to the local part-time VC, were hugely more experienced and better armed. Background: the 1st Australian Task Force, 1ATF, began arriving in Phuoc Tuy province of South Vietnam between April and June 1966. Following the establishment of its base at Nui Dat in Operation Hardihood, standing patrols were established outside of the base in the evening and clearing patrols sent out every morning and evening along the 12-kilometre perimeter. Initially, 1ATF under the command of Brigadier Oliver David Jackson consisted of 2 infantry battalions, the 5th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 5 RAR, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Waugh, and the recently arrived 6 RAR under Lieutenant Colonel Colin Townsend. Other units included the 1st Armoured Personnel Carrier Squadron, operating M113 Armoured Personnel Carriers, or APCs, 1st Field Regiment Royal Australian Artillery, consisting of the New Zealand 161st Battery, 2 Australian batteries equipped with 18 105mm L5 pack howitzers, and 6 155mm M109 self-propelled howitzers from the US A Battery, 2nd Battalion, 35th Artillery Regiment. Among other units present were 3rd SAS Squadron, 103rd Signals Squadron and an intelligence detachment. Support was provided by the 1st Australian Logistics Support Group at Vung Tau, and 8 UH-1B Iraqi helicopters from No. 9 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force. A fairly high proportion of the men were young national servicemen. The principal communist units in Phuoc Tuy were Viet Cong Chu Luk, or main forces from the 274th and 275th Regiments of the VC 5th Division. Under command of Senior Colonel Nguyen Te Trien, the division was headquartered in the Mae Tao Mountains. Operating in Phuoc Tuy, Bien Hoa and Long Cang provinces, it consisted of both South Vietnamese VC guerrillas and North Vietnamese People's Army of Vietnam PAVN units. The regiment the Australians would face in the Battle of Long Tân was the 275th. Signs of an imminent attack. In the days prior to the battle, Australian Signals Intelligence, SIGINT, using direction finding, had tracked a radio transmitter from the VC 275th Regiment and D445 Battalion moving to a position just north of Long Tân. By 16 August, it was positioned near Long Tân outside the range of the 1ATF artillery at Nui Dat. However, patrols were sent out but found nothing. Then, on the night of 16 and 17 August, the Nui Dat base came under heavy fire from mortars and recoilless rifles. The diggers stood too, anticipating that the barrage would be followed by an assault, but it didn't happen. Patrols from 6 RAR, including B&C companies, are sent out to sweep the area between the abandoned villages of Long Tân, Long Phuoc, and the Nui Dat 2 feature to attempt to establish the direction of the VC withdrawal. The sites from which mortars have been fired are located, but not much else. Into the plantation. Patrols continued the following day, and on 18 August, D Company, commanded by Major Harry Smith, leaves the Nui Dat base at 11:15 am, heading for the Long Tân rubber plantation with the task of relieving B Company, which is currently halted at the east edge of said plantation. D Company, 108 strong, are accompanied by a 3-man New Zealand Artillery Forward Observer Party under Captain Maurice Stanley, a very critical component as events would soon prove. Meanwhile, the rock and roll acts Little Patty and Cold Joy and the Joy Boys are setting up for an afternoon concert in the Nui-Dat base. Many of the soldiers are disappointed at the prospect of missing the entertainment, and as they patrol east, they sometimes pick up the sounds of the music through the trees. At 1 PM, D Company meets up with B Company on the edge of the Long Tân rubber plantation, approximately 2,500 metres from Nui-Dat. The company moves into all-round defence and posts sentries. While the soldiers have lunch, Smith and Ford inspect the area with a small protection party. The position appears to have been used by the VC as a staging area prior to the previous bombardment. The Australians find bloodstains on some equipment and sandals. First contact. Harry Smith takes over the pursuit and leads his men into the plantation at 3 PM that day, following signs of fresh tracks leading northeast. Second Lieutenant Gordon Sharp's 11th Platoon is in the lead, followed by Company Headquarters, with 10 Platoon on the left under 2nd Lieutenant Jeff Kendall and 12 Platoon on the right. Each platoon moves in open formation with 2 sections forward in arrowhead and 1 back on a frontage of approximately 160 metres. At 3:40 PM, as previously related, they make their first contact with a group of enemy soldiers who walk straight into the middle of 11 Platoon. Sergeant Bob Buick fires and wounds one who is picked up by his companions. The VC then bolt into the surrounding vegetation. The Australians see that, unlike the local Viet Cong, these men bear AK-47s and are dressed in the khaki uniforms of Main Force or Chuluk VC, but the significance of this is not immediately apparent. A Main Force Regiment. D Company continues moving east. However, 11 Platoon's rapid follow-up of the VC they just made contact with has opened up a 500-metre gap with company headquarters, while the other 2 lead platoons are also widely dispersed. At 4:08 PM, as 11 Platoon continue their pursuit of the VC in extended line, they come across a rubber tapper's hut, which they proceed to assault. The enemy have already retired, however, and so Sharp continues to push on through the trees towards the clearing. Shortly after resuming the advance, 11 Platoon's left flank is suddenly engaged by machine gun fire from a previously undetected VC force, killing and wounding several men from 6th Section. The platoon goes to ground and adopts firing positions, only to be engaged by a second machine gun. The firing lasts 2 to 3 minutes, then stops. Sharp then orders 5th Section to sweep across the front of the platoon from the right, but just as they begin moving, they come under withering small arms and RPG fire from the front and both flanks. Pinned down by the weight of fire, the men of the isolated platoon are now fighting for their lives. At that moment, a heavy monsoon rain begins. Visibility is reduced to just 50 metres and the ground is transformed into a quagmire. Amid the noise of machine gun, motor fire and the VC bugle calls, Sharp makes the assessment that the Viet Cong are in far greater strength than previously thought, and believes they are preparing to assault and overrun his position. As such, he radios for artillery fire at 4:12 PM as he moves his exposed section back into line, shifting his platoon into all-round defence. New Zealand's role in the battle. The Kiwi Artillery Forward Observer Party, led by Captain Maurice Stanley, along with the combined New Zealand and Aussie gunners back at Nui-Dat, play a huge role in the battle. Stanley's effective coordination of fire orders, often using just a map and his radio, constitute D Company's lifeline. Captain Stanley continues to coordinate the artillery in support of 11 Platoon and the rest of D Company. From his post with Headquarters Platoon, he cannot see 11 Platoon directly, and so in constant communication with D Company platoon commanders and the batteries at Nui-Dat, he begins to walk the fire into between 200 and 300 metres of their positions, which allows the rounds to pass over their heads and fall away from them. Landing beyond 11 Platoon, they explode among the VC as they form up for an assault. However, 11 Platoon are being engaged not just from their front, but also from both flanks now. Supported by heavy machine guns, the Viet Cong launches further attacks against them. and 11 Platoon is barely able to hold them off with artillery support and their own small arms fire. As the fighting continues, Major Stanley realises that a single artillery battery is insufficient and at 4:19 p.m. requests a regimental fire mission using all 24 guns of the 1st Field Regiment. The VC continue to assault, surging around the flanks of 11 Platoon. The Australians respond with more small arms fire, picking off VC soldiers as the rain and artillery fall. After making the required corrections, Stanley requests another regimental fire mission at 4:22 p.m. Still unable to see the rounds land, he has to work entirely from radio communications with 11 Platoon, adjusting the fire over an area of 200 metres using just a map. The pressure piles on. At 4:26 p.m. the artillery fires again at the enemy but misses the target. When Lieutenant Sharp stands to redirect the fire, he is shot dead. Sergeant Bob Buick takes charge of 11 Platoon and sends a desperate radio message requesting more ammunition before his radio antenna is shot off. Back with HQ Platoon, Major Smith, again initially believing his company was facing a unit of inferior size, begins to realise by now that in fact he is confronting possibly battalion-sized formation of a Viet Cong main force regiment. Actually the 275th plus supporting units, and that what had started as an encounter battle had now become a desperate fight to avoid being encircled and destroyed. 10 Platoon. At this point, now that radio contact with 11 Platoon is lost, Major Smith sends out 10 Platoon and a 2nd Lieutenant Jeff Kendall to find 11 Platoon. In the pouring rain, Kendall's platoon intercepts a VC unit of 30 to 40 men heading south, firing on 11 Platoon as they attempt to outflank them. Advancing to close range, 10 Platoon engages them from the rear, dropping a large number and breaking up the attack. As the surviving VC withdraw, Kendall pushes on. However, shortly after his men are engaged from a heavy machine gun, wounding the signaller and putting the radio out of action. Now also without communications and still 100 to 150 metres from 11 Platoon, 10 Platoon moves into a defensive position, just fighting to hold on. Private Yank Ackle. After this, in an outstanding act of bravery, signaller Private William Yank Ackle, who would later be awarded a mention in dispatches for his actions, arrives from company headquarters with a replacement radio, having ran 300 metres through heavy fire as he tried to locate 10 Platoon, killing 2 VC with his Owen gun on the way. Now that communications with 10 Platoon are restored, Major Smith orders Kendall to retreat under cover of artillery fire. At 4:50 p.m, completely isolated from the rest of the company and running out of ammunition, 11 Platoon fight on. Fortunately, Buick has been able to repair the radio and re-establishes communications with company headquarters, and with Major Stanley, who is again able to adjust the artillery by radio. At 5:15 p.m, 10 Platoon returns to the company HQ position, and Smith orders 12 Platoon Commander, 2nd Lieutenant Dave Sabin, to take 2 sections of his platoon, 20 men instead of 30, to link up with 11 Platoon. 12 Platoon runs into several VC groups attempting to outflank 11 Platoon and have to force their way through. 8 men are wounded. Ammunition resupply. At 6 p.m, 2 9 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force UH-1B Iraqi helicopters that were at Nieuwedat for the concert fly through the torrential rain and almost zero visibility to drop cases of ammunition wrapped in blankets down to the embattled diggers. Despite being exposed to heavy fire from 3 sides, 11 Platoon has maintained its position for over 2 hours, narrowly holding off the VC with small arms fire and artillery support. However, much of the platoon has been killed or wounded, and most of the survivors are now out of ammunition. To their rear, Sabin, with his 2 sections, throws yellow smoke in the hope that the embattled platoon will see it through the trees. Major Smith then calls for US Air Force F-4 Phantom aircraft to drop napalm across 11 Platoon's eastern frontage. The Phantoms soon arrive, however the rain and low cloud obscure the coloured smoke the Australians throw to mark their position through the trees. The artillery fire recommences as the VC form assault waves. D Company reunited. Finally, Buick decides to take advantage of a temporary lull in the fighting to retreat 100 to 150 metres west and regroup. On his signal, the platoon rise to their feet. Immediately, one man is shot and killed, while 2 more are wounded. Pausing as they retire, Buick sees Sabin's yellow smoke 75 to 100 metres away, and believing it to be Smith's headquarters, guides his remaining men towards it in what he would later describe as a mad scramble. Finding 12 platoon instead, yet still being heavily engaged by the enemy, the 2 platoons then move back to company HQ, covered by the artillery and the relentless monsoon rain. By 6:10 p.m, D Company are reunited, and the Viet Cong temporarily break contact. Major Smith redeploys the remnants of his company into a posture of all-round defence. The company occupies a shallow fold in the ground on a reverse slope, and this terrain feature proves helpful as the VC are unable to bring their heavy weapons to bear and can only engage at close range. Movement is soon detected through the trees, and at about 6:35 p.m, bugle blasts mark the beginning of a fresh series of assaults as the Viet Cong throw their men forward once more in human waves, the diggers desperately repelling them with concentrated rifle and machine gun fire. Captain Stanley calls in more artillery support from Nui Dat, but despite the mounting casualties, the enemy continue their fierce attacks. Rescue Force. 5:45 p.m. Whilst D Company are fighting for their lives, back at Nui Dat a relief force is being put together. First, B Company, which was returning to Nui Dat after their earlier mission, is ordered to turn around and find D Company. Next, Lieutenant Adrian Roberts readies the armoured personnel carriers of 3-troop 1 armoured personnel carrier squadron, loads them up with 100 men of A Company, 6 RAR, and heads out to Long Tân to find D Company. The 3-troop APCs manage to ford the heavily swollen Soi Da Bang Creek and reach the western edge of Long Tân, whence they enter the plantation in assault formation heading towards the battle. On the way, they surprise a sizable force of VC from D445 Battalion and use their 50 cal machine guns to great effect, cutting down over 40 of the enemy and dispersing the rest. More skirmishes with VC recoilless rifle teams and RPGs follow and are overcome. Viet Cong retreat. At last, like the US cavalry in a western movie, the APCs of 3 Troop arrive at 6:45 p.m. Continuing past D Company to the left, the APCs rapidly move forward, firing their 50 cal guns. They have arrived at a crucial point in the fighting, and the APCs and the now deploying infantry of A Company turn the tide of the battle. The Viet Cong had been massing for one more assault, which might have destroyed D Company, but the added firepower and mobility of 3 Troop reverses the odds, shattering their enemy's will to fight. And so the VC are forced to break contact and begin to withdraw as night comes on. The Battle of Long Tân has reached its conclusion. Legacy. Assessments after the Battle of Long Tân, based on captured documents and information from prisoners, suggested that D Company had faced some 2,500 Viet Cong, mainly from the experienced main force 275th Regiment. Enemy casualties were difficult to ascertain with precision, however more than 250 bodies were found on the battlefield, and it was thought that hundreds more had been killed or wounded, the bodies having been removed by the VC. The combined Australian-New Zealand force suffered 18 killed and 24 wounded, and all but one of the dead were from D Company. The Australians initially saw Long Tân as a defeat, however the action was later reassessed as a strategic victory since it prevented the Viet Cong from moving against Nui Dat. The Viet Cong also considered it a victory due to the political success of an effective ambush. 1 ATF received messages of congratulation from the US, South Vietnamese and Australian military commands in Vietnam, and from Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt. General William Westmoreland, overall US commander in Vietnam, considered it one of the most spectacular Allied victories to that point in the war. D Company 6 RAR was awarded a US Presidential Unit citation by President Lyndon Johnson in 1968. The Royal Australian Regiment and 3rd Cavalry Regiment were later awarded the Battle Honour Long Tân, one of only 5 presented to Australian units during the war. Commonwealth decorations were made to 17 Australians and New Zealanders, including the Military Cross, MC, to Harry Smith. The Battle of Long Tân stands as an example of the Aussie and Kiwi soldiers' courage and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness in the face of overwhelming odds. Mention here must also be made of the brave soldiers of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese People's Army of Vietnam, men that just kept on coming. I hope that you found this episode of the Ulysses Files interesting. Thanks for watching and see you next time.